All right, hello everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the pre-event Polar Bear Talk here at Tawich in the city. We are so lucky to have with us Dr. Greg Thiemann. He is a leading expert in polar bears, and I'll let him tell you exactly how long he's been studying polar bears. So he is an associate professor at the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University. He has handled and tagged around 500 polar bears in his lifetime, and his research focuses on the where, when, and how predators like polar bears forage, and so that we can better act to protect not only the predators themselves, but also the environment they are part of. His work also includes examining the changing relationships between northern indigenous communities and polar bears due to things like climate change. He is also a member of the Polar Bear Specialist Group at the IUCN. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Greg Thiemann.
Hello. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you very much for having me. It goes without saying, this is an absolute honor and a privilege to be here tonight and share the stage with the amazing people and performers to come. As Megan so generously said, my name is Greg Thiemann. I'm an associate professor of environmental and urban change at York University here in Toronto. And my task here today is to give you a very quick overview of sort of our collective understanding of polar bears. So we'll just jump right into it. I sort of hate to admit it because I'm such a young man, but I've been working on polar bears for kind of a long time. I started as a PhD student under the co-supervision of Dr. Ian Sterling in 2001. And since then, I've had the privilege of working on polar bears really across their Canadian range. This is a photograph of Ian and myself on the sea ice of the Beaufort Sea in 2004. And as I said, this is going to be a real quick overview of polar bears. There's going to be lots that we can't get to. So if you want to know more, I strongly encourage you to seek out Ian's book. It has everything that you want to know about polar bears. You can find it at your local bookseller or local library. And yeah, Ian passed away this past May, and so that was a huge loss for Canada. It was a huge loss for the polar bear world. He was the foremost authority on the species, without a doubt. I'm involved in a whole bunch of different aspects of polar bear research at York University, and we won't get into most of this stuff, but I just wanted to acknowledge that the stuff that I'll talk about today it's not me, it's the product of a huge number of dedicated professionals and participating organizations. So we'll start at the beginning, and polar bears are a pretty new species. They evolved from the brown bear lineage about 500,000 years ago, and in that short evolutionary time, they've evolved a number of important adaptations to life in the Arctic. They obviously have white coloration that helps. They have a very large body size, about 2 to 3 times larger than Arctic grizzlies. They have smaller, sharper teeth than grizzly bears, but maybe the most important distinction between the species is the habitat they use. Grizzly bears are exclusively terrestrial, and polar bears are exclusively marine. They are, ecologically in every sense, a marine mammal. They rely on the annual sea ice as their primary habitat to travel, to find mates, and importantly, to find food. Their primary prey, their key foods, are these two species, ring seals and bearded seals, which are found throughout the circumpolar Arctic. Although these are the most common components of polar bear diets, there are other marine mammals in the Arctic, and polar bears will eat them if they're around. So where they're available, especially off the east coast, southeastern Baffin Island and Labrador, polar bears eat very large numbers of harp seals. They'll eat walruses. They'll consume a surprisingly large number of beluga whales. Harbor seals, a more temperate species, are becoming more common and abundant in Arctic waters, and polar bears are eating them too. This is their primary habitat. Whatever they're eating, they're really focusing on these nearshore coastal areas over the continental shelf where the water tends to be relatively shallow, biological productivity tends to be pretty high, and seal abundance tends to be high. So we'll see the highest densities in these coastal areas. And we often think about polar bears as this sort of far away, remote, almost abstract species that lives in the high Arctic far away, and that's true. They live in the high Arctic, but they also live at surprisingly accessible latitudes. We have polar bears right here in Ontario. That's part of my objective, is to make sure you leave this room knowing that we have polar bears in Ontario. And the polar bears in James Bay are at about the same latitude as London, England, or other major metropolitan centers of Western Europe. So they're not that far away. Their habitat is a bit foreign. This is what it looks like. This is what the annual sea ice looks like. It's relatively thin, it's dynamic, and moves around in the currents and the winds. It cracks open, and those cracks become hotspots for biodiversity. They allow marine mammals to surface and breathe and haul out and give birth to pups. So that's where you'll find polar bears often foraging along these cracks. This is another look at that sort of habitat. So we see gray ice that's relatively thin. This larger patch of ice is cracked open and refrozen, and so this thin gray ice is allowing seals to create breathing hole here, another one here, a series of them across the far flow edge. In the foreground, we have some jumbled ice where a bowhead whale has likely surfaced to breathe. And through the whole scene, we see tracks of polar bears. So although there are no animals in this photograph, there's obviously lots of sign of biological activity and productivity. Globally, our best estimate is about 26,000 individual polar bears. And we used to think back in the 1950s that they were just one big population of individuals sort of roaming around the North Pole. And we have now a better understanding of the global population as comprised of 19 relatively discrete subpopulations. And tonight our focus is on this one. So zooming in now to the southern Hudson Bay subpopulation, this group designated, indicated here by SH. Jurisdictionally, it's shared by Ontario and Quebec and Nunavut. In the summer, all of the sea ice on Hudson Bay melts completely, and so bears are forced to migrate onshore. And the bears of the southern Hudson Bay subpopulation, the vast majority of them will migrate to Ontario. We see here a map produced by the Ministry of Natural Resources indicating the onshore habitat use of polar bears. So during the ice-free season, this is where they're found. Some of them will also stay on the islands of James Bay, but the vast majority will be in Ontario. While they're onshore during this ice-free period, they'll eat a variety of things. They'll feed on caribou carcasses, or if they can find them. They'll eat very large amounts of grass for some reason. They'll scavenge kelp that washes up in the intertidal zone. And there has been some uncertainty about the value of these terrestrial foods, energetically, ecologically, nutritionally. And a new paper that just came out earlier this year really advanced our understanding of what's happening during the onshore period. Researchers from Canada and the United States tracked very closely the behavior of 20 polar bears onshore in western Hudson Bay. And using tracking collars equipped with video cameras, they could document everything that these bears did, all the things that they did, all the energy that they spent and accumulated. And they found that, yeah, bears will eat a whole variety of things while they're on shore. Some will spend a lot of time foraging for food, and other bears will just basically curl up and go to sleep. And whether the bear adopts a foraging and food searching strategy or a curl up and go to sleep energy conservation strategy, they all sort of end up in the same place. They all end up losing about 1 kilogram of body mass per day during the onshore period. So the conclusion was that there was relatively little benefit of terrestrial foraging, even though some bears are doing it. When the sea ice refreezes in the fall, most bears will return to the sea ice, resume foraging, except for pregnant females. Pregnant females around this time of year, late September, will look for a den site, carve it out on a peat bank, and wait for the snow to fall. And she will remain in that den, give birth in December, nurse her cubs until March, before they emerge in March, so up to 9 months after she's come on shore, and the family group will remain around the den for a week or so before they migrate back onto the sea ice. One of my students, Tyler Ross, is working on modeling the denning habitat of polar bears in Ontario, and he's identified this coastal strip right along Hudson Bay and James Bay of key polar bear denning habitat. Tyler's also using some data from collars we deployed on bears in James Bay in the mid-2010s to look at the movements and space use of polar bears in James Bay, and has identified some bears as remaining in James Bay really throughout the ice-covered season. So some bears will, in fact, barely leave southern James Bay. They'll just occupy very small areas of this very southern distribution and just stay there. And this spatial separation from the rest of Hudson Bay seems to be driving what we know is genetic distinction. The polar bears of James Bay are genetically distinct from Hudson Bay or from any other bears in the world. So this is all an illustration of the fact that the proposed marine conservation areas off the coast of Hudson Bay and James Bay will be absolutely instrumental in protecting both the coastal and the on-ice habitat of polar bears. So we've got this life history cycle for polar bears in Hudson Bay where they would prefer to stay on the ice year-round, but the ice melts in the summer. Their bears are forced to migrate on shore and spend this onshore period, spend the ice-free period on shore. They then return, most of them, to the ice in the fall, but increasing evidence, including some work from my lab, has indicated that bears, especially in the winter, also aren't doing that much feeding and are, in many cases, losing mass throughout the winter. So it's really this on-ice spring and early summer period associated with seal pupping that's really driving their energy balance through much of the year, allowing bears to feed, accumulate fat that they then rely on, certainly through the onshore period and through much of the winter as well. And as we continue to warm the climate, what we're doing is stretching this onshore period where we know bears are losing mass, but simultaneously compressing this spring foraging period. So we're asking them to do quite a lot as the climate warms and sea ice conditions decline. And the climate's warming. The Arctic is and has been warming at a rate about 4 times faster than the global average, and really regardless of future emission scenarios, the North is going to continue to warm fastest. That rapid warming is associated with rapid sea ice decline. The summer pack ice, that ice that persists throughout the summer, that I have a map in my office from 2011, so it's not ancient history, from Natural Resources Canada, that labels this summer ice as the permanent polar ice. It's not permanent, it's declining at a rate of about 12% per decade. More locally, in southern Hudson Bay, we're seeing an increase in our open water period of about 5% per decade. And we know enough about climate and sea ice and polar bears to make some pretty simple projections about how this is going to play out. Climate warming has and will continue to lead to altered sea ice. Less sea ice for polar bears means less availability of food. Less food obviously means lower body condition. Because pregnant females fuel all that time in the den, their entire period of pregnancy and early lactation from fat stored on their body, we know that lower body condition is going to lead to fewer and smaller cubs. Smaller cubs have a lower chance of survival and recruitment into the adult population, and less reproduction is going to lead to population decline. These are all pretty simple mechanisms, simple relationships, but we shouldn't expect them all to play out in the same way at the same rate across this vast range of polar bears. And that's precisely what we're seeing. We're seeing lots of variability in how polar bear populations are responding to climate warming and sea ice decline. We're seeing some populations that are declining. The areas in orange have likely declined relative to historic levels. The blue areas seem to be stable. A couple of populations indicated in green have even increased. In one case, as the population recovers from past overhunting. In another case, where the habitat is actually getting better as some thick multi-year ice thins and is replaced by more productive, biologically productive annual ice. And then a big brown area that we really have no idea what's happening. In Ontario, the southern Hudson Bay population seems to be mostly stable. Some indication of decline in the mid-2010s, but the most recent assessment done, led by the Ministry of Natural Resources through an aerial survey, indicated that Ontario that southern Hudson Bay has about 1,000 bears. The adjacent subpopulation, though, in western Hudson Bay has seen a pretty dramatic decline. From a maximum of about 1,200 bears in the 1980s, it declined to about 800 bears in 2011, so a decline of 32% over a quarter century. And then the most recent assessment, again in 2021, found just over 600 bears, so only about half of that peak from the mid-1980s. And these two adjacent subpopulations are increasingly sharing bears. So we should expect that this is going to have impacts on polar bears. As we started, polar bears are marine mammals, and like any species, habitat loss leads to population decline. In Canada, federally, polar bears are assessed as are considered a species of special concern, which is notably a less imperiled status than the US or international designation of threatened and vulnerable. These are equivalent, but more imperiled and based on projected significant declines in the coming decades. In Canada, we haven't seen yet those large declines that would warrant an uplisting to threatened, but more locally in Ontario, we recognize that they are a threatened species and they are considered a threatened species under the provincial legislation. And this more imperiled status was arrived at through a consideration of the smaller size and increased threats that polar bears in Ontario face at the very southern limit of their range. And given these issues, given the fact that, climate warming is a collective problem that is ultimately going to require a globally coordinated solution, it can become frustrating what individual people or communities can do to try to advance conservation. And one of the things that we're trying to do is collaborate with First Nations in Ontario to take local action, and specifically to facilitate coexistence between people and polar bears. So partners at the Ministry of Natural Resources and Polar Bears International have been working with the Moose Cree First Nation, with Pewanak, with Fort Severn, to distribute and equip and train people on the use of various deterrents: bear spray, cracker shells, flares. Polar Bears International funded the design and manufacture of 3 polar bear traps that have now been distributed to Moose Factory and Pewanak and Fort Severn. So just hopefully encouraging people and polar bears to live together in a way that maximizes and advances polar bear conservation as well as public safety. So again, quick overview. Lots that we didn't cover. As Megan mentioned, I'm a member of the Polar Bear Specialist Group. We have a website. It's got lots of great information about polar bear science and conservation and management. A quick thank you to the agencies that have funded my work, the students and collaborators that have made it possible for me to be here. So thank you for having me, and yeah, happy to answer any questions.
Okay, yes, thank you so much, Dr. Thiemann. That was
Thank you.
wonderful. I learned so much about polar bears right here in Ontario. So we do have some minutes for questions, so just raise your hand. I think because we're all pretty spread out, just yell it really loudly, and I'm just going to repeat it for our viewers online. So, oh yes, I saw this hand first. Yep.
How do you estimate the number of bears in any area?
A great question. So the question is, how do we estimate the number of bears in any area? And it's not easy. So first and foremost, it's not easy. And second, there are a number of different ways. The sort of gold standard is to individually mark polar bears. So that involves capturing a bear, giving it some identification, very often a tattoo, and then doing that several times over the course of 3 or 4 years, and then using the proportion of marked individuals that you recapture to generate a population assessment. This method gives all kinds of additional information about age structure that we can use to really understand the dynamics of the population. We can also replicate that approach with DNA marker recapture. So if you collect a small piece of DNA, you can identify an individual and identify those individuals that are recaptured over time. Increasingly, what jurisdictions are using, though, are aerial surveys. So we're just going to fly an aircraft in a systematic way over the space and count the number of bears, which sounds self-evident, but it gets complicated because you can never count every single bear. You're going to miss a large proportion of them, and so the mathematics of estimating the number of bears, the proportion of bears that you miss gets complicated. So there's different ways with different levels of precision. Great question, though.
Yeah, I would love to have that job, just flying around counting polar bears. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. I was just wondering, when you mentioned that there were different subspecies or varieties in these different regions, what level are you talking about in terms of the differences? If there's a short answer to the kinds of differences that exist?
Yeah, so the question is, what are the kinds of differences that exist among polar bears in these different groups across, a vast range? And we should preface this by saying that these are all one species. There's no designated subspecies within polar bears. They're all one species, and relative to many other species, like wolves, for instance, or grizzly bears, they have relatively little genetic diversity. The genetic difference between polar bears in James Bay and the Beaufort Sea, for instance, is measurable and real, but relatively small compared to the variation in other species that occupy huge ranges. So these units are, for the most part, demographically separated. So the individuals within them will breed with each other, really more than with adjacent subpopulations. So they're separate populations in the sense that they function like separate populations, but there's certainly exchange in between them.
Would you see a difference in their coloring or their size or their feeding habits? I just wondered at what level what are you measuring when you measure those differences?
When you measure those different units, you're measuring demographic differences, and so this is very helpful in assessing sustainable harvest. So to know how many bears are in Western Hudson Bay is very helpful, is essential really, to managing a sustainable harvest of bears in Hudson Bay. Genetically, what they would look like is not very different. The largest sort of separation, say, between bears in Alaska and bears in Greenland, they are very different body sizes. Like the bears in Greenland are pretty small. And whether that's a function of different genetics or different nutrition or different contaminant levels, these are all still ongoing questions. The short answer is it's a little bit of all of those things. But yeah, the most dramatic difference sort of visually among these different populations will be body size and not really coloration or other considerations.
In the back there.
I was wondering, is there any truth to the fact of the suggestion, rather, that polar bears are interbreeding with grizzly bears?
So yeah, great questions. So the infamous Pizzly bear or roller bear or whatever. So it's a fascinating story, and certainly this sort of genetic introgression is a major conservation concern for biodiversity writ large. For polar bears, though, not so much. There was, so it all started, anyway, to tell a brief story, it all started in 2006 when a non-resident sport hunter came up from the United States. This is all legit and perfectly supported by local communities. Came up to shoot a polar bear in the Northwest Territories and shot a bear and was going to take the trophy home and was stopped by a conservation officer that said, "You have a tag for a polar bear. This is not a polar bear." And that set off a bit of a kerfuffle, and it turns out that the conservation officer was exactly right. It's not a polar bear. It was a hybrid between a polar bear and a grizzly bear. And subsequently, a whole bunch of bears of these various hybrids and various generations of, you know, a female polar bear had bred with a grizzly bear male, or their offspring had mixed as well. There was like a dozen of them, either captured during research or harvested by Inuvialuit hunters. The end of the story is that, as far as we know, all of those bears are dead. And it started with one female polar bear that bred with two male grizzly bears. One of those male grizzly bears ended up mating with its own daughter, which is the whole thing. But this was all a very isolated situation that seems to have exhausted itself. So researchers at the University of Manitoba actually continue to essentially search for hybrids in the genetic samples of bears across their Canadian range. And yeah, haven't found a single hybrid outside of that one cluster in the Northwest Territories. So pretty cool.
They should make an HBO show like Game of Thrones, but polar bear edition. Yes.
You mentioned that they're now foraging for other food sources during the summer months. Is that just because we picked up a new technology, or do you think that may be a new behavior based on maybe less nutrition out of their winter feeds?
Yeah, so great question. So this idea that bears are eating more and maybe different things during the ice-free period while they're on land, is that a product of us just paying more attention and having better technological tools like video collars, or are they eating more on shore because they're hungrier or whatever? And yeah, again, it's a little bit of both. So there was a study in 1975 published by Russell looking at bears in James Bay, actually, and identified a huge number of things in their diets, from berries to other kinds of berries, to caribou, to driftwood and rocks. Like, these were based on stomach contents. So we knew in the 1970s that polar bears will eat anything, but there's definitely increasing accounts, certainly from researchers working on ground nesting birds in the Arctic. They're seeing more bears. There are unquestionably more bears visiting these seabird colonies than there used to be. And we know that because these are subject to long-term research. So it's a little bit of everything, I think. Bears are hungrier. They're spending certainly more time on shore. But we also have better tools for understanding their ecology.
Okay, I'm so sorry. We are out of time for questions, but Dr. Greg Thiemann will be available after the show to mingle with people, right?
Of course.
Perfect. So if you see him, he's very approachable, so please ask him your questions. But for now, we do have to exit the theater as they set up for the rest of the show. So if you could please make your way back out to the lobby, that would be wonderful. And let's hear it one more time for Greg.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.